Anna Proskurina is involved with academic projects and communication, and specifically with Democracy International EV. She is passionate about civil society, the opportunity for Ukraine to join the EU, and she also engages in public conversations about Ukraine's difficult history, democracy, and human rights. Welcome to Silicon Curtain Podcast. If you like the material we create and our fantastic guests, then please do like and subscribe to help boost the popularity of our videos on YouTube and help other people discover the amazing content. Anna, I'm delighted to welcome you to the channel.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, we're gonna talk about a range of topics. Mainly, it's going to be sort of civil society history, and you know, this transformative process that's been happening in Ukraine for 30 years, and then sort of trigger points of Maidan, Orange Revolution, etc. But before we start, I mean, we have to touch on what happened yesterday, and it's a very difficult topic to broach because I've seen a lot of people, including guests on this channel, incredibly emotionally touched by what happened yesterday, perhaps more than anything else in the war. So I'm going to start by what's your reaction to Russia's terror tactics, ecological terror tactics?
As you mentioned, you have kind of a cynical point of view on the actions, and I do so as well. So in a way, unfortunately, it was not a surprise for me. But of course, in a way, it touches me personally because I have not direct relatives, but some people on the flooded territories. And of course, it's a catastrophe. Probably those who created them, the Russians who blew up the dam, didn't even fully understand what they are getting into. But of course, with the consequences ranging from potential nuclear catastrophe with the largest nuclear power plant in Europe to drainage of the huge territories, destruction of ecosystems of the whole area, pollution of Dnipro River and the Black Sea, and even potential chemical threats for the region, erosions. And of course, it also makes farming impossible on the drained areas, which is central and south Ukraine. It's a huge ecological catastrophe. It's also a huge humanitarian catastrophe. Over 16,000 people are left without homes anymore. And the most suffered area is the left bank of the river, which is occupied. So people from that areas, they cannot evacuate. The highest point of cynicism is that Russian army is now even shelling the trains that evacuate Ukrainians from the deoccupied territories of Kherson. And also from what I know from firsthand experience of the people I know in the territories, even mined areas are eroded already. So the mines are also flowing with the water and exploding. So it makes even harder for people to evacuate.
It's horrific chain reaction, isn't it? And you have to wonder, well, not too hard, but you have to wonder if they had really, you know, spent any time thinking about the consequences of their actions. And that's, I think, the difficult thing to figure out, isn't it? While most of the media, and we'll come on to the media in a minute because they're particularly weak on this topic, still, you know, who did it? When, you know, everybody, it's obvious to everybody who understands the Russian mindset who did it. Similarly with Nord Stream, I think, as well. But the question is going to be, did they do it for short-term tactical advantage, or is this part of a sort of scorched earth policy as Russia prepares to be ejected from Ukrainian territory? I mean, I think it raises a huge number of questions. This could be something they try to spin, you know, this could be informational warfare as well as physical warfare to keep their Z patriots happy.
Yes, absolutely. It's a good question. And well, I think, of course, I don't know the original purpose of them, and I believe it was a short tactical advantage. I don't think when they did it, they fully understood the scale of the problem they are creating, because also Russian media in the beginning, when it was not, fully understood how massive the problem is. Let's say the informational stream that they created was not aligned. So I don't think it was initially the informational purpose, but of course they have a, let's say, succession line, because during the Second World War, when the Soviet army was escaping the German army, they also destroyed the dam at that time. So it's it has its origins, and yeah, of course, it's also their tactic as usual. And I see the informational tactics they use now just as a consequence of what they did. So they exploit their actions in every bit possible.
And this has very much been an informational war, and this is one of the areas we're going to talk on, isn't it? Because you're engaged in digital activism. You're looking at the impact of, say, sort of social media on sort of politics and systems. And I think even though Russia's tactics are extremely crude, and even when you go to MH17, it was crude at that time. Nonetheless, by throwing millions of different narratives and sowing confusion, unfortunately, our media systems seem to be hardwired to repeat some of those narratives or have this sort of both sides kind of nonsense, which obscures actually the reality of what's going on.
From the if we distinct from that array of medias, those that are obviously pro-Russian, paid by Russian government, etc., partially I could not blame them, because if you study Russian history and history of the rest of the countries in the region as something minor and always under the influence of this great Russian state, it's really hard to change perspective from looking in such a colonial view on the region to looking on what Ukrainians think of Ukraine or what Belarusians think of Belarus. So of course, partially I cannot blame them, but still, in one of the interviews that I conducted with a actually fascinating person, Ukrainian volunteer. She's a poet by education and by her calling, but now she's a paramedic in hospitaliers. We touched a little bit upon the question of propaganda, and of course, propaganda doesn't mean that you're not responsible for your actions. And I believe the same goes for the media.
This is it. And, sometimes I wonder whether it's through ignorance or laziness or the format that they stick to. But certainly the media does not, I think, sometimes enlighten these events, but rather sort of clouds them, or it continues what actually the main purpose of Russia's propaganda is to sow confusion, apathy, and prevent people from taking action. It's not like in communist times, where you're trying to convince somebody of a particular ideology or an idea, and you're trying to encourage them to go out and take action based on that idea. This is more about sort of undermining the very concept of truth.
Yeah, but also it's kind of undermining the concept of other things than Russia existing. So I find Western media still being hard accepting the idea that other things in the region exist, and even if what I was so stunned by it, even when the news is about Ukraine, actually, it still says what Russia thinks, and again, as Timothy Snyder in his lectures said, nothing exists forever. And I believe, in a way, we need to also think that Russia have not been existing forever and will not exist forever. So sooner or later, we need to start thinking about this region of Eastern Europe region in a different way, in a non-colonial, non-Russian centered way.
And academia itself, it's not just the media, is it? Academia has been quite slow, actually, to build these sort of post-colonial narratives into the way it works. Even the very structure of most academic departments that, where Ukrainian will not be a sort of separate faculty. And most Eastern European countries are sort of all lumped in together into the so-called sort of Slavic world. This has to change as well, fundamentally, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And don't get me wrong, I still understand that, of course, from my point of view, unfortunately, Russia is a still big power, not only in the region, but in the world. But, well, I believe it needs to be changed. And one way of doing that is to change your approach. Um, and as I said, of course, um, in the United States, as far as I know, the only two courses that teach Ukrainian history and focus only on Ukrainian history is Serhiy Plokhy, who is Ukrainian, and Timothy Snyder, who is a great ambassador of Ukraine. And I think today during the conversation, I will refer to his course a lot of times, and I send everyone who is interested to his course because it's fascinating even for me. Um, but of course, changing the academic perception is, I think, what will bring the changes in other areas, also in media, also in just people's minds, because I think academia would be the starting point of broadcasting these different views. And unfortunately, I think in a way it's what Ukrainian state failed so far to be more proactive with it, but what civil society of Ukraine is really succeeding in. For example, in Germany, still in a lot of cases, feeling the guilt for the Second World War only towards Russia and not towards the rest of the region. Still in German universities, I see a lot of Ukrainian scientists doing a lot of projects also about Ukrainian internally displaced population. And of course, it's the start of the change, but I believe the state should be more proactive with it as well.
Well, we'll come on to Germany in a minute because I think I didn't introduce that properly. But you're based in Cologne, and I think it'd be interesting to explore because Germany's been on quite an interesting journey the last 14 months from established positions and perceptions and starting to move. But let's tackle that question of history because there are some key things that have been taking place within Ukrainian culture and society, and of course, one of those is the rise of civil society, political activism, triggered by the sort of catalyst of Orange Revolution and Maidan, or Revolution of Dignity. And I'd sort of love to know your view on that. But there are other things being catalyzed, aren't there? So an increased interest in history, because many Ukrainians would not have known the detail of their history. They would have known the Soviet sort of imperial lens version of it. So that's a journey of discovery. And of course, many Ukrainians are now shifting from Russian being their primary language and Ukrainian maybe the secondary, and they're shifting that around, and there's a huge uptake in Ukrainian literature and language learning. So let's lump all that together. Could you comment on the sort of, these huge shifts in almost the self-education of Ukrainians?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And in a way, it's still a journey for me. I have to admit, I did terribly in history course at school, also because I found it incredibly boring. It was just a number of facts, a date, but no, analysis what actually happened. And from also what I learned about civil society of Ukraine, it has an interesting feature of um, being especially united in the peak moments of you know historical shifts happening. And what changed with Euromaidan revolution, the revolution of dignity, civil society stayed united. But still, during the years of independence, I think Ukraine is still in the way of discovering its own history. Um, I was stunned to know that actually historical manipulations from Russian side started not even with the Soviet Union, but with Ivan the Terrible appropriating the history of Kiev and Rus and creating the mythology of this big Russian power in the region, and massive falsifications that took place under the Peter I, who basically started the process of rewriting historical documents, clothing them in archives. So it's really hard to know your history when you don't have access to the truth about your history. And when the historical agenda of your, let's say, neighbor was to draw a succession line from your history to their history, because I believe it was what was Russian agenda in history is to create a line of direct succession from Kiev Rus to Moscow, which is basically depriving Ukrainians of their historical heritage. And this is what we are starting to discover now. And yes, of course, Ukraine has been under the strong influence of Russian language, as it sometimes in some regions for the last decade still was and still is in Europe, I believe. But Ukrainian identity had times when it was something very wanted, very, beautiful and attractive. And it was not even this century, but last century, the beginning of last century. I brought from Ukraine a magazine. It's a literary reportage magazine. And I found, it's dedicated to historical memory. That's why I'm showing it. So I think that's, the topic we're talking now. And I found an interesting point there that even from that times, from 1970 on, Ukrainian identity was a democratic choice in a way. If you're against empire, you're with Ukrainians. And I believe that this is what has been happening with Ukraine for the last 30-something years and probably longer. We are choosing to be Ukrainians every day, and of course, shifting to Ukrainian language is part of it. I found a lot of people being surprised that for a lot of people, Ukrainian identity was not what they were born with, this strong sense of identity. For me, for example, it was the revolution of dignity. I mean, during the Orange Revolution, I was a kid. I was like, 7 years old, 5 years old. But the revolutionary of dignity, I remember strongly. And my parents actively participated in it. I remember family discussions, very heated, especially because part of my family, my grandparents come from Russia, even though they lived in Ukraine for the last 50, 60 years. So, of course, they, in a way, had different views on it. And for me, personally, and I believe for a lot of people, that was the source, the starting point when they started discovering their identity. And being from Kiev, a lot of people at that time started to shift from Russian language to Ukrainian language and discovering our culture. And of course, it's a constant process. I believe probably never ending.
And that, I think that's an interesting aspect, isn't it? Because as it's shifting, changing, evolving, that is not something a government can legislate for or even should legislate for. It's an organic process. And I think the other realization, and we'll come back to the sort of imperial mechanic that Russia operates in a minute, because I think there's a lot to explore there. But what first struck me when I went to Russia in the 90s is that so much of its sort of traditional culture was taken over by the state, regulated by the state, turned into a kind of canonical, this is good, that's bad, you have to learn this, you're not civilized unless you've read these books or done this. That process of the state taking over what people think and read and what is considered to be cultured, I came to think that actually stifles and destroys that organic process of change and innovation. And for me, that seems to be a big difference between Ukraine and Russia. I don't know. And nepotism also feeds into that quite heavily.
Yes, absolutely. The state, as you said, the state can take over this organic process, but the question is what the outcome would be. I strongly believe that when the state takes over the process of self-discovery of a nation and says, and this is also part of the Russian policy towards Ukraine, saying what the history or the culture should be, or how it is the right way of doing things, instead of looking actually at what the history, culture, and identity is. Yes, people can fall for that. People can follow that for a while, but the question is, how strongly would people personally relate to that? Ukrainian state, in a way, is not taking over, probably supporting, that involvement, maybe not as strongly as I would personally wish, but it starts from the people, definitely. And when the people start the process, they, tend to completely fall for that and completely immerse themselves in discovering. So it's not something placed from above, it's something you live with, and that's the difference.
And it comes into very it comes into very simple things like folk music. I was and we'll come to Vishivanka as well, because again, the reinvention of traditions, I think, is the exciting thing about Ukraine, which I didn't see much evidence of in Russia. And one of the things is folk music and folk dances. Where I studied in Edinburgh, I was part of a sort of folk club, and there's this people play the so-called classics and so on, but they're constantly reinventing the formats, the tunes, they're applying new words. There's a process of renewal and invention going on. But when I went to see sort of folk dances in Russia, it was the same thing over and over, the same costumes over and over, and it was as if the culture had been just sort of frozen. And that lack of innovation is what got me thinking, well, why is it like this? And then I realized it's the deep tendrils of the state taking over everything, ossifying it, basically killing it by trying to control it.
Yeah. Firstly, when the people do not truly associate themselves with what they're doing with their culture, when they have not lived through that culture, of course, they will lack innovation and they will lack even the very basis for interpreting how they understand this or that in their culture. And secondly, of course, in a way, that's what we are fighting with, especially elderly population of Ukraine. But when you lived for a long time under the pressure of the state, and when you are even afraid to have a single thought in your mind, of course, you will lack the creativity for interpreting things culturally, historically, just through your life. And that's the difference with Ukraine, indeed, because Ukrainians were, sort of um, deprived of the opportunity to explore their culture for so long that now, when this process of stepping away from this Soviet or Russian culture has begun, people are discovering more and more, diving deeper and deeper, and try and interpret also what is happening with this war through the previous history of Ukraine, through the previous culture, and find parallels from 400 years ago, 100 years ago, to modern days. And when people can associate themselves with the history they are learning, with the culture they see every day, I think that's where the creativity starts.
And there's another aspect of this imperial mindset, and that is to acquire other people's heritage, appropriate aspects of other people's heritage. And that sort of got me thinking as well. I'd be interested to see what you sort of think of this, is that process of acquiring a culture, and as you said earlier, creating a set of sort of lies to cover up that theft, that seems to go hand in hand with genocidal behavior as well, because you have to terrorize people into forgetting that this theft happened, to believing the lie,
Or to
and
get rid of people.
yes, exactly. But that process that we're seeing now, the destruction of Ukrainian heritage, the theft of Ukrainian artifacts, it seems to go back all the way, as you said, to Ivan the Terrible. He was creating these myths of Russia, putting on the clothes of Kiev and Rus, but at the same time, he was wiping out any diversity or any other political systems like the Novgorodian Republic, and various other, Suzdal and various other states that existed in southern Russia, destroying any other potential, opposing formats. And it seems to me that rather than big geopolitical points of view, these two ideas are fundamental to understanding why Russia attacked Ukraine. Ukraine exists as a sort of riposte to its lies. It actually undermines the foundation story of Russia, but also it provides an alternative format, an alternative system and way of living.
Yes, there are so many points to start actually, but I mean, you can see how centuries-old Russian propaganda now is a mechanism to justify the full-scale war, because the president of Russian Federation is using pseudo-historical facts of arguing what part of which country should be under Russian territory, and arguing how the history should go instead of how it's going. But of course, the deep reason for it is that it's impossible to have a great country, great in terms of, this power that it has, the power that government has, and the influence on the whole world, and great just in terms of capturing a lot of territories without a glue that is, kind of merging the view of the whole nation together. And for centuries, this, well, I wouldn't say uniting, but supposedly uniting idea was the myths of great Russian nation, probably better than anyone else, originating from ancient states, that is born to be unifying the rest of the world, or at least the rest of the region. And existence of Ukraine, fall apart of the Soviet Union, is of course, um, a great doubt in minds of the people. Why is this state Ukraine existing if we are so good? Why do not they want to join us? Um, Probably, still Russian propaganda is, of course, very strong in Russia. So not all the people are, consciously thinking about that. But I think the government of Russia is really deeply afraid of their own people, that the people start think. And because Ukrainians are acting so much and are such an active society, um, government also is afraid of these actions in Russia. And of course, this is the big ideological basis behind this war, to justify existence of Russia itself. This is what this war is actually about. It's not about existence of Ukraine or which part of the world Ukraine should be, but it's about what is the basis or the history for Russian existence and what is its heritage.
Yeah, and that suggests that it's far more fragile, perhaps, than anyone has expected. Um, and it's not just Ukraine that's been undergoing a transformation. Germany as well, traditionally, has been very accommodating, let's say, of Russia during the Soviet period. Then with the construction of Nord Stream, there's a deep desire in Germany to make some compensation to Russia, as you say. I mean, misplaced war guilt, because really it's Belarus and Ukraine which perhaps should get the larger portion of German sympathy, but that war guilt is not, subtle enough. But Germany, I think, is starting to wake up to what Russia is and not see it through these sort of rose-tinted lenses. And you're in Germany, so how has it been observing this process taking place?
To come back a little bit, also, I believe that this Russian, as you said, misplaced sense of guilt is also a part of Russian propaganda. Because when, after the Second World War, Stalin toasted the Russian nation as the nation who won the Second World War, it was also the part of way of thinking to undermine Ukrainians and Belarusians and all other nations for all they did in all the aspects of their lives. So, of course, yes, it's again propaganda. But coming to your question itself, I was actually very lucky because my bubble in Germany was always open-minded and always understanding. Yes, I probably got a couple of questions about is Ukrainian is really a dialect of Russian or things like that, but it's just the minor things. So I could not probably observe this process from the individuals, but from reading the news. It's exciting to see the start of the transformation, but I believe it's a long way ahead, because now we can see that it's like an on and off process, and we still see the hesitation. And as much as it is the role of Germany, as I said, I also believe it is the role of Ukrainian state and then Ukrainian civil society to support the countries who are hesitating in making the choice and showing them what the history was like.
And I think that's an interesting point. I mean, other speakers that I've had on the channel have said that Ukraine, firstly, maybe it's a national character, maybe it's because they're considered this sort of junior partner in the Soviet Union project, or even a vassal state. There's a certain amount of humility. Historically, Ukrainians have not pushed themselves really hard on other people. But I think that's starting to change, isn't it? I think Ukrainians, one, are getting bolder, but also they're realizing that in order to ensure their survival, they need to create a far clearer impression of what Ukraine is and what it means and what the differences are in Western governments and publics. Well, not just Western. I mean, there's a challenge because people in China, India, and the so-called global South, South Africa, and so on, many people are getting a very distorted view of the situation.
And also within Ukraine, I believe, yes, we now have far clearer and far better understanding of what Ukrainian identity actually means. But still, as I said, it's always the process of self-discovering, and it shouldn't stop for a second, of course. And still, there are many people who are not really into Ukrainian, informational space and headspace. And especially after, hopefully, soon the occupation of territories, it will be also part of our task to create this clearer and united sense of identity for the people who for so long were under the influence of other forces. But yes, it's true. And I'm really happy to see that, Ukrainians are getting more proactive and understanding that it is also our role to show who we are to the world. I believe that for that we truly need the openness of others. Also because with this war, you either live it through your life or you believe those who lived it. So I hope that other countries will choose to believe us rather than to live through the war again. And for that, we truly need to, you know, not to create a line of politics for that. Of course, it, as you said, it would have lack of creativity probably. But of course, we need a stronger, as I said, stronger support from the state, because only civil society is, kind of a pointed action. And from how I see it, we need a stream of information. For example, I know that some civil society actors are now trying at least to strengthen the connections in Africa, coming to several countries as a monitoring mission for election, for example, but also taking their time there to actually, explore country's culture and show what Ukrainian culture is like. But then again, if it's only the politics of certain NGO and not the country, it's just a, drop in an ocean.
That's unfortunately the case, isn't it? And but you are involved in civil society initiatives yourself, and I think it's these changes are never going to happen overnight. But the more drops into the bucket you have, the more that influences. But I think Ukrainian Vibes is something I wanted to ask you about, and that's a project
Yes.
you're involved in. Could you describe a little bit what that is and what its impact is intended to be?
Yes, absolutely. So it's originally actually the German project by an organization, Engagement Global, and supported by German Federal Ministry. And they kind of find the project realizers, the three NGOs who are the partners for the last 3 years. It's Democracy International, which is my current workplace, and two Ukrainian organizations, the National Ecological Center of Ukraine and Change Communication. It's not the full year project, so to say. It's only 6 months. I was in the second year of this project, and what we describe it is a communication project aimed to, show Ukrainian perspective on Ukraine, get people talking about European identity, Ukrainian identity, and what these things are, and just exchange real life experiences, because we live off a lot of stereotypes and a lot of media ideas. And when you sit together in a European dome, which is a wooden cupola, and it might look weird, but it creates a nice sense of coziness and trust. And when you get to listen to real stories, that's when you change your mind. Last year, when the full-scale invasion just started, me, another Ukrainian girl, and two German girls, we created the vision for, on one hand, exploring difficult history and participation in Ukraine, how society understands its history and how it acts, and also trying to assess the consequences of this war, environmental and also in terms of human rights. Those were the topics. This year, I'm less involved because there is a new team, so every year it's a new team. But from what I know, one of the topics they will be discovering is European identity and Ukrainian identity within it. So everyone who's interested, I strongly encourage you to follow us, follow Ukrainian Vibes and Democracy International. I think I will provide you with all the links. But as I said during the last year's discussions, being engaged in an informational space and trying to, educate yourself is also a way of civic participation.
And that's, I think, incredibly important, isn't it? I mean, first of all, the point you raised there is that Ukraine very much now sees its future as part of Europe, as part of the European family and culture, and not just a passive member, but clearly wants to become a very active member of that. So let's touch on that. But also, as we sort of get towards the end, I'd also like to touch on the role of digital activism in electronic voting, which of course is also advancing very rapidly in Ukraine. It's going to be one of the forerunners in introducing digital democracy, social media literacy, and so on. And there's a lot, not only for Ukraine to learn from Europe, but I think there's a lot for Europe and the UK to learn from Ukraine's experience.
Well, Ukraine has seen itself as a member of European community for a long time, not only because it was a choice of either being suppressed within this Soviet machine or post-Soviet machine, but also because I think Ukrainian values are more in line with what we call European values. And of course, I believe that some of the Ukrainian identity features is what Europe can learn from us. For example, the willingness to sacrifice everything you have for the democratic values and not take these things for granted. That's what I think is really needed, because not reading the news or distracting from the news is a privilege, which in Ukraine we don't have at the moment, unfortunately. And regarding the digital activism and media literacy, I think it's very much connected, and that's what Ukrainians are learning now. For example, my point has always been that now the whole Ukrainian society is a digital activism in every person, because everyone's posting, sharing. I have my friends collecting money, even with like 200 subscribers, collecting huge sums for army. Again, this is the place where civil society is sort of in a way taking responsibilities from state upon itself. But now it's the times of hardship, and that's what we need to do. But we also learn to be responsible for what we post. When you know that if you post a picture of a rocket that just flew into your garden, and that will help Russian soldiers to shoot more precisely, more correctly, that is something that, changes your way of thinking on the content you post as well. So, of course, I don't want people to learn that way, to be responsible, but in general sense of responsibility for the any action, and also digital action, is what we are learning now.
And I mean, one other aspect, I think, and if you read enough posts by Ukrainians or go to sort of lectures and talk to people, and if, like I've been doing, immerse yourself in Russian propaganda narratives, you also start to realize that there's a certain responsibility to be very precise with your language. And I think Ukrainians are extremely aware that precision of language, apportioning guilt, clarity of thought, is absolutely important. And you see this in a whole range of Ukrainians who are active online, really thinking about the nuance of every word. Unfortunately, that always doesn't come across when you go to sometimes even Western lecturers. I've even heard, read in the media, and you'll have, experts. You'll even have some, Western academics who are extremely pro-Ukrainian, and yet you'll just think that wording was either clumsy or that wasn't really reflecting reality. There seems to be a sloppiness of language, which, when you're under attack from Russian disinformation, is actually a dangerous thing.
Yes, but Ukrainians understand that very well, because we lived through that and we still keep living through that. So when we see certain wording fly into our informational space from the country that actually killing our people, of course, that wording is something so distinct, so bright for us. But for people not from Ukraine, who are, yes, very pro-Ukrainian, but their life is not depending on whether it's Kiev or Kyiv, Ukraine or the Ukraine, and these minor things, for them it's not such a distinct, visible thing. And also, of course, again, we have a very Russian-centered educational and media system. So it really has a lot of efforts in it to see what is wrong with the phrasing or with the word. Of course, I encourage everyone to to really mind that, but yes, it's again, it's the process.
It's like using words like you know, evacuation, when really what we need to say is deportation or abduction of people and children. You know, it's understanding the reality and the context of what's going on, rather than just reproducing, almost like a meme, you know, some of those propagandistic narratives or tropes.
Yes, absolutely. But that's again, if it's your child who is taken away from you, you would never say it's an evacuation. So it's just, again, that's the point that was raised by several people in several talks. You either live through that terrible experience yourself, or you trust with the wording and with the experience those who live through that. So just, I think my message would be just trust Ukrainians with what they say and what they trying to show, because otherwise, unfortunately, you might have to live through that yourself.
That's, I think, a very important place to sort of probably wind down the conversation on. That's a very, very powerful thought there. The last question is, you know, are you, broadly speaking, despite the terrible events that day by day are unfolding, are you broadly optimistic for Ukraine's future in Europe?
Always. I'm broadly optimistic always because I know very well Ukrainian people. And in that way, I was never doubtful. So even if the whole Ukraine was occupied, I had never a single doubt that Ukrainian people would fight for that. And now, of course, we definitely will have some moments of hardship ahead of us. But I am really, truly positive for the future. But also, I know with what cost it will come, unfortunately.
Well, Anna, I very much appreciate you spending your time talking to me on this. These are absolutely fascinating topics, which I think we could probably talk for hours on. We'll put links to the organizations you mentioned, and if people are in the vicinity of any of the events that are being run by them, then I would strongly encourage them to go along and take part.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. And also, I think we didn't have a time to touch upon what I work directly with direct democracy and e-governance, but you will definitely have several links below. And I recently posted a couple of articles and interviews on Ukrainian direct democracy, which is a fascinating topic. So yes, I strongly encourage you to do that, but also to maybe, I have a little question for you, Jonathan.
Okay.
To conclude the interview, I wanted to ask you, what was your motivation to, step away from that colonial view that we talked about and dedicate the whole podcast to Ukraine? What inspired you to do that?
I think, I mean, that's probably a very long answer, but I think that imperial concept is not something that I'd just suddenly realized, you know, in February of last year, or even in 2014. I think the awareness of what a malign entity the Russian imperial concept is goes back to living there in the 90s, and just hearing the mythologized history. Now, every country has its myths. Every country, to an extent, mythologizes its history. But it seems to me Russia is unique in how it fully weaponizes that mythology and reprograms people to repeat these sort of tropes. And I just asked myself, while I was there in the 90s, where does that come from? You know, is this organic or was it created? And I came to the conclusion more and more that everything is scripted. Almost everything that people say and think, apart from a few exceptions, is purposefully crafted and scripted by, you know, those in charge, the huge secret state. to program people to be compliant. And then you have to ask, well, why are they doing that? And and then you dig deeper and you see that actually there's the imperial purpose behind it. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that I think we've all learned or started to question since February last year. Russia's role in the Second World War is one where we've kind of ignored the fact that for a third of the Second World War, Russia was fighting with the Nazis, for goodness sake. They were a key partner of Hitler. And we just sort of, we've taken the Russian propaganda on that line. But I think I've always had this sense since the 90s that Russia does not exist to benefit its people. Therefore, it has to lie to its people and get them to go along with something that is damaging to their own interests. They are poorer, they're weaker, they're unhappier, and now they're dying for an idea which they embrace, but which is killing them. And, you have to ask, well, what is the purpose of that?
Yes, thank you.
So that was quite a long answer to the question there, but there are other reasons as well. I mean, I learned Russian and I don't feel guilty as such, but I do feel that that I have to use that knowledge. I'm able to watch primary resources in Russian and perhaps, have access to materials that are not available to people who don't speak Russian. And there's a certain duty to translate those and communicate those.
Yes, and thank you for your works and thank you for spreading the awareness about Ukraine. And I believe, as you said, all those drops in the ocean matter.
Well, thank you so much, Anna. Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава!